Paper Mario is a series that's been in a little bit of a flux lately. Originally developed as an RPG, the more recent titles have been designed to fit in better with the action-adventure genre, while casting away almost all of the RPG mechanics that made the series special. While it's natural that developers will occasionally try something new with established franchises, there's a bit of a problem with the last couple Paper Mario games that Nintendo just refuses to recognize. They really aren't that fun. The decline in the series' quality is especially noticeable when compared to both the original Paper Mario and Paper Mario: The Thousand Year Door. But before Paper Mario ever had a chance to be a thing, we have to take a look back to 1996 when Nintendo and Squaresoft teamed up and released Super Mario RPG: Legend of the Seven Stars for the Super Nintendo. Super Mario RPG was such a groundbreaking title that not only saw gaming's biggest mascot crossing over into the RPG genre, but it also managed to stand out from its RPG contemporaries. Most RPGs at the time followed the Final Fantasy approach, with a more serious save-the-world plot and gameplay that essentially forced players to make quick decisions by navigating complex menus with seemingly endless options. Super Mario RPG wasn't like that, and it set out to be a much more accessible adventure to newer fans. It was bright, it was colorful, and it took a more lighthearted approach to its storytelling and its characters. It even brought with it a new type of gameplay to the RPG genre with its dynamic timed hits battle system. Timed hits allow players to stay engaged in every single fight, and it lets players influence the outcome of every attack dealt and received through specific inputs. And this was a surprisingly radical shift from RPGs at the time, because players were not only directly in control of the pace of every battle, but the result of battles were determined more so by skill rather than the ability to quickly find menu commands. The timed hit system was so invigorating and needed in a genre that could otherwise be so hard for new players to get into. Super Mario RPG received critical acclaim from reviewers and fans alike, and sold over 2 million copies despite being overshadowed by the impending launch of the Nintendo 64. Its success led to the development of its direct sequel in the late 90s and early 2000s, which was originally titled Super Mario RPG 2. The development for this game was radically different from Super Mario RPGs, mainly because Squaresoft was no longer working with Nintendo after deciding to partner with Sony, due to Nintendo's decision to use cartridges instead of CD-ROMs for the Nintendo 64. Partnerless for a time, Nintendo had a big decision to make regarding who should get the project. Ultimately, the big end gave it to Intelligent Systems, a second-party studio that was well known in Japan, but not so much the rest of the world at the time. Intelligent Systems was best known for creating the Fire Emblem series, which was exclusive to Japan until the mid-2000s. Everyone now knows Fire Emblem as one of Nintendo's key franchises thanks to Marth and Roy's inclusion in Super Smash Bros. Melee, but back then, it was a surprise to give Intelligent Systems a game of this caliber. Despite their relatively unknown status, the decision did make some sense, because even if they didn't have any experience making a traditional RPG, Fire Emblem's tactical RPG nature made it a pretty good fit. As development began to wrap up, the game's title was changed from Super Mario RPG 2 to Mario Story in Japan and Paper Mario in the West for legal reasons. The game was released on February 4th, 2001, and I remember being so hyped for it at the time. A sequel to my favorite game ever in full 3D should be better than Super Mario RPG, right? Well, here's the thing about that. Paper Mario is not Super Mario RPG 2, and back then, that's all I wanted. When I first played it in 2001, I liked the game, sure, but I could only think of it as an inferior sequel to what had come before, and that attitude never really allowed me to appreciate it as its own game back then. But even if Paper Mario didn't match my exact expectations back in 2001, it's impossible for a great game to be completely overlooked. It took a while to appreciate Paper Mario on its own merits, but as I grew older, the game has become one of my all-time favorites. I couldn't see it back then because it wasn't what I wanted, but Paper Mario is nothing short of a worthy successor to Super Mario RPG. Other players must have thought so too, because Paper Mario today is a franchise with several different games spanning more than 15 years on various Nintendo consoles. But right now, it's time to take a look back where it all started and find out what makes Paper Mario such a unique and great experience. This is my Paper Mario design analysis and retrospective. Paper Mario opens up with Mario and Luigi receiving a letter from Princess Peach inviting them both to her castle for a party. Residents from all over the Mushroom Kingdom have traveled for the occasion, and the open space is a nice way for players to learn how Mario controls. It's not a Mario platformer, but this is still very much a game with some basic platforming elements in it. I like how it takes almost no time for the story to get going. Bowser crashes the party and lifts Peach's castle into the sky. I actually really like this setup because it's a nice shake-up on how Bowser's normal princess capturing shenanigans go, but it still feels really in line with his character. There's a scripted fight with Bowser right after, and I think it's pretty cool how the first battle the player has in the entire game is actually against the main antagonist. The purpose of this battle is twofold. It immediately establishes how much stronger Bowser is than Mario, but it also introduces the Star Rod, an item responsible for his newfound strength. The fight concludes with Bowser knocking Mario out of the sky, and even though it's early in the game, the developers have already established the two castles as the end goal of the entire adventure. This is great because the game leaves such a strong initial impression, and that looms in the back of players' minds throughout the entire game. Players always know the castles are up in the sky, and they always know where Bowser is. There's a bit more story when Mario lands, but it's pretty typical Mario RPG stuff. Bowser has kidnapped and imprisoned the 7 Star Spirits, who are the guardians of the Star Rod hailing from Star Haven. They give us our immediate objective, and that's to seek out the nearby Shooting Star Summit. I like how the Star Spirits are characters rather than objects, because it subtly changes the tone of the game and makes players way more emotionally invested when saving them. With their brief appearance, Paper Mario has set up the main plot for the entire adventure. The intro to Paper Mario from here on out does an excellent job of teaching players a bunch of core mechanics in easy to understand ways, but it does come with a significant hit to the game's pacing that players experience after a few minutes. Mario's landed in Goomba Village, where Kammy Koopa shows up and creates a literal roadblock. That's the catalyst that leads the players to discovering the hammer, which is Mario's other primary attack method outside of his jump. The hammer is a great inclusion. It gives Mario a way to interact with obstacles on the overworld, and it also gives them another attack option in combat. Obtaining the hammer triggers a boss battle against Junior Troopa, and he's something new to the Mario RPG series. Junior Troopa serves as a rival character that will occasionally show up and challenge the players to unexpected fights. A rival character is a perfect inclusion in Paper Mario with his humorous writing and tone, but Junior Troopa has never really been my favorite. The battle itself introduces the hammer in combat, which is nice, but it's just another fight that essentially boils down to an interactive cutscene. The journey back to Goomba Village introduces the player to several new mechanics, so let's count to see how many there are in this opening stretch of the game. 1. Enemies are on the overworld and there are no random encounters. 2. Heart blocks can be found on the overworld and they'll restore HP and FP, providing a quick healing resource for players. 3. Enemies have different characteristics, as shown by the variety of Goombas in this first area. This introduces some strategy to the combat since certain enemies can only be attacked in certain ways. And 4, players can learn about the incredibly well implemented First Strike mechanic, which allows both Mario and overworld enemies to land a preemptive blow on the opposing side. The First Strike mechanic is one of the best things Paper Mario introduces to the entire Mario RPG series. This mechanic makes player-enemy relationships very dynamic, with both a sufficient reward and penalty, such as dealing damage first to gain the upper hand, or receiving damage first and being forced to battle. It adds a lot of potency to the moment-to-moment gameplay, where players can actively influence how nearly every battle is conducted throughout the entire game. It also adds a nice wrinkle into HP management, since prioritizing first strikes can save players unneeded damage in the long run. Back at Goomba Village, the player is introduced to badges, which are equipable mods for Mario's attacks. We'll go into more details about those later, but for now, the more significant upgrade is Goombario, Mario's first partner. Unlike more traditional RPGs of the era, Mario's party is just limited to one additional character by his side. Every partner in the game has a set of unique characteristics that can be used in battle and also on the overworld. Goombario, the player's first partner, is able to tell Mario details about enemies in battle and about places on the map. This high level of utility, combined with each partner's own personality, makes them so memorable, and I think it's why a lot of Paper Mario fans have such a strong attachment to these guys. After obtaining Goombario, the game finally hits that wall where the pace slows down to an endless crawl, and that's because players have to go through seemingly endless tutorial battles. There's a mini-boss fight against some red and blue Goombas, and then there's a fight with the much larger Goomba King, but they all don't really provide anything for the player because they're essentially unlosable fights that are just time sinks. The prologue is roughly 45 minutes long to this point, and all players have done is fight various colors and sizes of Goombas while getting some basic story exposition. But a few shoehorn mini-bosses aren't going to stop Mario on his adventure, and they definitely won't stop me either. The Goomba King may not have much of a story presence, but beating him does reward us with a nice story-driven cutscene where Bowser mentions that the first Star Spirit is close by in the Koopa Bros fortress. We also get to actually see the Koopa Bros, who are highly energetic and comedic villains for the first chapter. And hey, you'll always get a +1 out of me for a Power Rangers parody. After the cutscene, players finally reach Toad Town, and while there's a lot of stuff to do here, it's a bit limited at the moment. Luckily for us, it's only a short journey north to find Shooting Star Summit, and that's where we learn a little bit more about the stolen Star Rod from the Star Spirits themselves. Even though it's a little bit more detailed story exposition than we got before, it's really not anything that we didn't already know. But the real treat here is the next scene, which introduces Twink, the spunky star kid who's determined to help our damsel in distress. Twink is absolutely awesome and perfect in every way, and you should love him as much as you possibly can. He's extremely expressive, borderline over the top, in every single situation, and that really drives home his overall character of a wannabe try-hard star spirit. I love how Peach immediately wishes for him to go defeat Bowser like it's no big deal, and it causes him to become super disheartened. The real reason though that Twink is great is because he gives players the Lucky Star, which is an item that finally opens up the full extent of Paper Mario's battle mechanics and lets them shine as bright as the Star Spirits themselves. That's right, after a full hour of the intro, players are now finally able to do timed hits, the signature gameplay style of the entire Mario RPG series. Though in Paper Mario, for whatever reason, they're referred to as action commands. Straight up, I have no idea why Intelligent Systems decided to withhold timed hits until the end of the prologue, and it's the main reason why Paper Mario starts so slow. Timed hits are the heart and soul of the battle mechanics and thus the game, and requiring an item to unlock them over an hour in really starts the game on a low note. Action commands improve Mario's offensive and defensive capabilities when players time interactions correctly. Pressing the A button before landing a jump executes a double jump for twice the damage. Holding the control stick back and releasing it with proper timing doubles hammer damage. Pressing A before an incoming enemy attack reduces or negates their impact. It's a simple system, and the frame windows for landing these commands are generous, but it makes battles more active and less passive, and is a lot more engaging and fun. Losing or winning a battle now is due to the player's skill rather than simple turn swapping, and that's an empowering feeling that makes battles feel rewarding. But the action command system would be a little bare bones if that's all it was, and that's where Paper Mario's brilliant badge system comes in and elevates the concept to the next level. As mentioned early in the video, badges are equipable items which augment and enhance Mario's abilities, while occasionally granting him new ones entirely. They fit right into Mario's action command timing, and on some rare occasions they can actually alter the action commands to something a little bit different. This approach prevents action commands from getting stale, but it also means that the game never expects players to suddenly learn new commands to be effective in battle. Of course, this system would be totally broken if there was nothing to limit the player use of badges. Each badge has a set number of badge points, and more powerful badges generally require more points. Any badge combination can be equipped as long as Mario has enough points, and that allows for an unbelievably deep level of flexibility and customization. There are so many different badges in Paper Mario, and they can range from basic ones that simply increase power, to other unique badges that let Mario spin dash faster and further on the overworld. And this gives players all kinds of opportunities to experiment with different playstyles. The fact that these badges are completely interchangeable at any time has a monumental impact on the design philosophy of Paper Mario, because it means that players can pick and choose Mario's abilities whenever they want. This adds a ton of moment-to-moment strategy and always keeps the gameplay fresh, while still all falling under the umbrella of player agency. Experience points, called star points in this game, work a little bit different than in most RPGs. Mario gains a level for every 100 points collected, and the points scale depending on game progression. For example, an enemy that drops 5 points the first time will drop less points when fought at a higher level. This scaling has major ramifications on the overall game design. Because the designers can essentially dictate the level the player will be at any time, and players can't really overlevel, the designers are able to create a wonderful skill curve that's present throughout the entire game. Paper Mario is a game that feels accessible, but not one that is so overly easy that it requires no effort. There's even a few appropriately placed difficulty spikes that can be a bit of a challenge later on in the game. But when you do collect 100 star points and finally level up, you get this amazing and remarkable screen. No, really, what you're seeing here is what makes Paper Mario work. It's the secret sauce that differentiates it from other RPGs, and it's done in a phenomenal way. When Mario levels up, the player can permanently increase his HP, FP, or badge points. These aren't additional perks, they're the actual stats that Mario gets throughout the entire adventure, and they're the only stats he gets. Instead of having set level ups, Mario's increase in power and capability is placed 100% on the player. This makes Paper Mario a truly special RPG for a couple of reasons. For one, this along with the badge system creates a very compelling and deep level of customization to the overall player experience. After the beginning of the game, when the number of available badges is limited, a playthrough of Paper Mario from one player to another can look radically different. HP will help newer players with survivability, whereas FP and BP will give more experienced players more options on the battlefield and can make Mario and his partners more versatile in combat. Players can mix these strengths to any degree throughout the adventure. And the best part of these systems interacting is that despite the incredibly deep level of flexibility, it's actually really easy and intuitive to understand when playing the game. Even though it's supposed to be an accessible RPG, Paper Mario at this point trusts players to shape their own adventure on each individual playthrough. The overall battle and experience system isn't perfect, however. Partners don't have HP, which cuts out an entire layer of strategy since the player only needs to focus on Mario's HP. Instead, partners get injured when they take an attack, and they're forced to skip their turn when they receive damage. This has the unfortunate effect of making partners feel more like extra attacks than characters in battle, since missed turns are the end result. Furthering this notion is the fact that partners cannot use items during battle, which honestly seems more like an oversight than anything else. If partners had the ability to use items, I think the overall difficulty curve could have been a little bit steeper, which may have led to an ultimately better game. There's also standard status ailments common to the RPG genre which are varied and interesting, but battles will rarely feature them, and they can just be a little bit overpowered when they come from the player's side of things. But overall, while there are some room for improvements, it's remarkable how intelligent systems made the right call in almost every aspect when creating an accessible and deep core RPG battle system. Now that we've learned to punch our foes' lights out, it's time to ditch the prologue after more than an hour of gameplay. Mario meets up with a strange resident of Toad Town named Merlin, who is an ever-present guide that players can use if they ever get lost during the game. Using him is totally optional, so there's no harm if he's here, and he does make the game ultimately more accessible. Merlin does have a story purpose here, and with a little bit of his lightning magic, he reveals the Koopa Bros hanging around Toad Town and sends them off running, allowing us to finally get started with Chapter 1. Chapter 1 starts out with Mario and Goombario heading down Pleasant Path towards the Koopa Bros fortress where the first Star Spirit is being held captive. This area is a traditional grasslands theme for an early Mario game, and the best way to describe it is just standard. I want to point out the Koopa Troopa enemies that the devs placed here though. While it's no surprise that Koopas make an appearance this early in the game, their inclusion here is smart because they demonstrate to players that enemies have their own unique properties and states in battle. It's a simple inclusion and players most likely won't even realize they're learning something new, but it's a smart move by the developers to showcase this quickly after the player gets the ability to use action commands. Before players can reach Koopa Bros Fortress, Mario finds himself in Koopa Village where there's a little bit of trouble. Fuzzies have invaded the town and taken all of the Koopa shells, and it's up to the player to retrieve them. I'm not really much of a fan of this part in Chapter 1 since it interrupts the flow after the slow prologue, and there can be some really irritating fuzzies here. The reward is great though, because helping a special blue-shelled Koopa introduces us to Mario's new partner, Kooper. Kooper has some super useful abilities both in battle and on the overworld. In combat, Kooper can use his shell to damage and take out multiple grounded enemies at once. This ability carries over to the overworld, where he can be used to hit switches and retrieve items that are far away. With Kooper by our side, it's not long until the player gets to Koopa Bros Fortress. It's interesting how Paper Mario is structured because it's really reminiscent of the Zelda series. Mario will go to a new area, explore it, and then come across a self-contained dungeon filled with traps, keys, and a final boss. I think this structure works great for Paper Mario because it keeps the objective always in focus, and it makes it super easy to understand the overall progression of the game. Inside the fortress, players must try to get to the top by solving puzzles that raise and lower various staircases. Although this can sound a little daunting, the fortress is actually completely linear. This is a spot where I really like the linearity because it allowed the developers the opportunity to incorporate a lot of storytelling elements. While storming the fortress, the Koopa Bros constantly try to sabotage Mario and his party by creating various traps. These short cutscenes are hilarious, and they give the Koopa Bros some awesome character development. And at one point, the player even has to come to the realization that they have to fall into one of their traps on purpose in order to progress. Falling into a jail cell, though, does have its perks, because here we obtain our third partner, Bombette. Bombette is a fantastic addition to the party, because even before the first major boss fight, the player now has several combat options available. The fortress up until this point has been littered with cracked walls, so players can now access them with Bombette to ultimately make their way to the top. On the roof, there's a nice action set piece where players have to maneuver around bullet bills or otherwise enter fights with them. Completing this leads to the Koopa Bros battle, and it is an awesome two-part fight. The first part sees Mario going against the Trojan Bowser with the Koopa Bros controlling it from the inside, and although this part isn't very difficult, the dialogue and back and forth here is absolutely terrific. The Paper Bowser line in particular always gets a laugh out of me, and is one of the best one-liners seen in the entire game. The second phase sees the player taking on the Koopa Bros one-on-one. The music in this fight is fast-paced and bombastic, and it sets the tone for the entire battle. And that's appropriate because the Koopa Bros are the first boss that can really hit the player back and be a real threat. Bombette and Kooper can end this fight quickly if players are aware of the optimal strategy, but even if it's a bit short, this battle feels satisfying, and the Koopa Bros are a wonderful first major boss. But before we can rescue the Star Spirit, Paper Mario introduces another signature gameplay element, the Peach scenes. At the end of every chapter, players get to take control of Peach, and this is an inclusion I really like. These scenes give players a chance to reflect on the chapter they just completed and soak in the victory over the chapter boss, but they also break up the pace and introduce new types of gameplay. These scenes also develop Peach as a character, much more so than previous Mario titles. She can get lonely, scared, but she also tries her best to help Mario in order to also help her own situation. The first scene is super short and only involves sneaking out of her room, but it does let us learn that the next Star Spirit is being held captive in the Dry Ruins. Back at the fortress, Mario is formally introduced to Eldstar, the first Star Spirit. Paper Mario introduces the last of its battle mechanics on the player here, Star Powers. Every time a spirit is saved, the player is given a new power in battle. This is great because it provides players with motivation and excitement when they're near the end of a chapter because they know they're going to get a usable and tangible reward. Star Powers require star units, which regenerate every turn, or Mario can regenerate a larger chunk of it at a time if he uses the focus command in battle. The first star power given to the player is Refresh, and it simply restores HP and FP, which is a good first power to have since it can help players survive a little easier. The way back to Toad Town sees the player being surprised by a Junior Troopa fight, but honestly it's pretty easy and forgettable. Toad Town has opened up completely at this point, and it's honestly one of the best hub worlds in any RPG I've ever played. There's just so much to do here. There's sewers that connect various regions of the world, a fighting dojo with optional bosses, a badge shop that gets new stock after every chapter, a place to cook items to increase their potency, item shops, a jazz club near the docks, and even these weird pig things called Lil Oinks that you can hatch for items. Players can even go back to Mario's house and interact with Luigi at any point, and can view their own battle statistics. One thing I didn't mention is that Toad Town also has a train, which is the gateway to the start of Chapter 2. The Dry Ruins are found deep within the Dry Desert, and that place is even guarded by Mount Rugged. Players find a familiar face here in the form of Parakarry, the mail carrier from the start of the game. He's lost a few letters on the mountain, and he decides to join the party once the player has found all of them. With his wings, Parakarry is able to target airborne enemies that Mario can't hit, and he can also lift us over gaps that Mario's jump just can't reach. This is a good inclusion, but I feel like the devs could have made it even better, because Parakarry's animation while flying over gaps feels really slow, and it's really cumbersome to use when it's required frequently. Parakarry, though, also comes with a unique side quest. Players can now find letters scattered all over the world and give them to their original recipients. This is a good way to do some world building through character relationships, and I really like it. Parakarry helps us get through Mount Rugged, that's guarded by an optional mini-boss named Buzzar, and the group finally arrives at Dry Desert. First and foremost, the desert is absolutely massive. It's broken down into a grid system, but overall it's mostly an empty promise. Players can find a few items scattered here and there along with some badges, but there's nothing significant off the beaten path. Well, that's not entirely true. If you're lucky, you may just stumble upon the legendary question mark block that you can hit for 416 years to crash Paper Mario. Mario arrives at Dry Outpost to try and learn more about the ruins, and there's a quick side quest here to retrieve a lemon from the Oasis for a mysterious resident named Sheik. The Oasis also contains the first instance of a super block, which upgrade partners by one level and give them an additional ability. Players even get to choose which partners get upgraded whenever they find a block, so sorry Goombario, you're not going to see much use anymore. This is an interesting way of leveling up party members since it has nothing to do with battling or gaining experience, but it does reward players who are willing to explore the overworld with a very beneficial prize when they find them. Back at Dry Outpost, the player is now able to reach the highest house in town after proving themselves loyal to Mustafa. we find out that Sheik, of course, was Zelda after all, who used her powerful magic to somehow escape their universe and hide from Ganondorf for 7 years. But for real, we get the Pulse Stone, which points Mario to the direction of the ruins. Placing the Pulse Stone in the rock pedestal reveals the Dry ruins, and the aesthetic here is absolutely terrific. The dark night sky contrasts so much with the orange-colored sand, and for reasons I'll never get, the developers decided to force the desert area to reset to daytime as soon as players leave this room. Although it doesn't affect gameplay at all, this is a missed opportunity to make the desert and ruins feel more menacing and threatening. Dry ruins are a lot more open than Koopa Bros. Fortress. There's a rising sand gimmick that really isn't that interesting since it only affects one room below Mario, but unlike the fortress, there are multiple points where the players have an option to go in several different rooms or do things in different orders. There are some bottlenecks to make sure the player ultimately goes down the right path, but for the most part, there's some real choice and freedom here. Using a different approach from Chapter 1, Paper Mario does a nice job of building up the boss's character without actually showing him, by having him taunt the player as they move throughout the ruins. It's not as direct as the Koopa Bros building traps as Mario's storming the fortress, but it really does add to the anticipation before the boss is revealed at the end of the dungeon. Along the way, Mario also finds the Super Hammer here to break stone blocks, but I wish that the developers gave it more functionality because it doesn't really feel like a huge upgrade. It does do more damage in combat, but enemies now scale to account for it, and yellow blocks are simply replaced with stone blocks everywhere. While it does do more damage in combat, enemies now scale to account for this increased damage, and yellow blocks are replaced with stone blocks on the overworld. It's essentially a cosmetic upgrade that makes using the hammer better than jumping in battle. After collecting a few different shaped stones and solving a puzzle by placing them in the right spots, Toot and Koopa is revealed as the boss of the Dry ruins. Although he's not a bad boss fight, I find him significantly less interesting than the Koopa Bros. He summons Chain Chomps to help him, but the real problem here is that Mario can only hit him with a jump even though the hammer is now the better option. It causes the battle to go on a lot longer than it feels like it should, and it makes the fight feel simply underwhelming. Toot and Koopa's never really stuck with me, and I'm usually happy to see him go, but I don't think it's fair either to call him a bad boss. The second Peach scene involves sneaking around the castle to try and dig up the third Star Spirit's location. There's a few extra goodies lying around that players can find if they explore the castle, and they can even give them to Mario via a magic chest that sends them to him. It's nice to see the developers give Peach some more gameplay elements instead of only using her to find out the next Star Spirit location. The stealth mission pays off though, and it's revealed that the next Star Spirit is being held by someone named Tubba Blubba in Gusty Gulch. Chapter 2 wraps up back in the desert where the player is introduced to Mamar, the Star Spirit whose lullaby attack can put enemies to sleep when it works. Chapter 3 starts super quick after the previous chapter since players are bound to encounter a cutscene near the forest when coming up from the Mount Rugged train. A strange-looking and mischievous Boo is caught scaring one of the Toad Guards, and he informs us that his master has actually stolen the Star Spirit and requests our presence. This must be the invite to Zelda's in-game universe that Parakarry lost because Paper Mario incorporates another homage to it in the next area called Forever Forest. Here, players must carefully observe the geometry of the forest to identify unique characteristics to move on. Every room has 4 different choices, and the visual characteristics get more and more difficult to spot as the player gets deeper into the woods. The sound design here is wonderful and features a variety of animalistic sound effects to make things feel tense and claustrophobic. Boo's mansion lies at the end of the woods as our tasty destination where the doors are made of chocolate, and it's one of my favorite locations in the game. The goal here is to reach the top floor of the mansion in order to talk with Lady Bo, leader of the Boos. The place is full of minigames and traps that the Boos have laid out in order to trick Mario, and there's a sweet innocence to the Boos here because they're basically just doing this because they can. The minigames and traps aren't very difficult to solve or avoid, but one of them does net the player the Super Boots, which are a much better inclusion than the Super Hammer because they have new utility. The boots let the player use the Spin Jump, which is a ground pound that can reveal hidden floor panels and break wooden boards on the ground. Lady Bo is introduced at the top of the mansion after completing all the minigames, and she delivers a great twist on Chapter 3. Under her command, the Boos actually captured the third Star Spirit that was fleeing from Tubba Blubba, and she's using it as ransom to enlist Mario's help. It turns out Tubba Blubba has a sweet tooth for some tasty ghosties, and they've been helpless ever since he showed up. He's supposedly invincible with a big secret, but they just haven't been able to figure out what that is yet. As a result, Bo decides to come with us to see the mission through and joins the party. Bo is my favorite partner in Paper Mario by a significant margin, and I just gotta talk about her for a bit. On the battlefield and overworld, Bo can turn Mario invisible to avoid enemy attacks and a variety of hazards, but the main reason she's great is her character. I love how Bo's motivations to join the party are directly tied with her own goals, and they don't just occur because of happenstance like when Mario meets Bombette in the jail cell. She orchestrates the whole plot point for Chapter 3, and this gives Bo a presence that other partners just don't have. Even when Bo talks, she almost always ends her dialogue with her signature maniacal laughter that really just expresses her mischievous characteristics. It was around the time Bo joined the team when I discovered that some things can be done in a different intended order in Chapter 3. There's a junior trooper fight that is supposed to occur once the third Star Spirit is saved, but I actually triggered it and fought him immediately after getting Bo because I wanted to go back to Toad Town to get a few items. Although this does not have a significant impact on the gameplay except for making the fight a little bit tougher since I was underleveled at the time, it was really neat to see how the game still had some surprises for me even though I've gone through it a bunch of times. Gusty Gulch is just another boring, brown, sandy area. I've always been surprised that the developers put this part in, since Chapter 2 had an almost identical aesthetic. It's really short, so it's not a big deal, but I think sticking with the forest theme would have been much better. Not only would it have made Tubba Bubba's castle feel more foreboding since the forest would be larger and it would be hidden more, it would also give the illusion that Boo's mansion was a secret place nobody could find. Again, it's no big deal, but it definitely would have had a stronger contrast from Chapter 2 if it was all forest. You know, the term castle probably isn't the most appropriate for Tubba Bubba's place, because it's more of a house with giant oversized furniture. This leads to some interesting platforming challenges that have all been visually contextualized for this dungeon, and it's a really great way the developers can create a more immersive experience. The structure of the castle is a lot more linear than Dry Dry Ruins, but there's a lot of extra rooms off the main path that contain items and badges. Some rooms have sentinels that take players back to the beginning of the castle, and while they're easy to avoid with Bo, I don't really enjoy them very much because it just adds a bunch of time retreading the castle grounds if the player happens to get caught. One other interesting quirk that Tubba Bubba's castle has is that there's only a single enemy type found here, and I'm a bit conflicted on it. The lack of variety here is exceptionally notable, especially when compared to previous parts of the game. But the Clubbos here are almost always sleeping, and that gives players an opportunity to use stealth in order to gain advantageous first strikes. I tend to fall on the side that it's ultimately okay since the stealth mechanic is a pretty cool addition and players can easily avoid battles, but there'll be some players here that find this a bit disappointing. Mario finds Tubba Blubba sleeping in his room at the top of the castle, where he also discovers a literal talking key that reveals that the Windmill in Gusty Gulch house is a secret. There's a surprising chase sequence here where players can actually fight him, but it turns out that his reputation is accurate and he can't be damaged. The talking key grants players access to the windmill, where there's long sets of hallways that are completely silent and really capitalize on the moment to build up that tension before Tubba Blubba's secret is ultimately revealed. It turns out that that secret is that Bowser used the Star Rod to separate Tubba Blubba's heart from his body, and his heart's been using the body as a puppet this entire time. It's a great plot point, and it's cool how the chapter boss is against the heart after the reveal, but this is one area where the developers really missed the mark. The boss only has 2 attacks, and his more powerful one is always telegraphed to the point where he openly hints at the player that they need to use Bo's invisibility to hide from him. There's really no explanation for why the heart boss fight turned out this way, and while I enjoy it because of the fun plot point that it sews up, I really think that the developers could have done so much more here. There is a small follow-up fight that sees the heart and body reunited, but it generally ends in a single turn and is used to button up Tubba Blubba as a character more so than a gameplay addition. The Peach scene that follows the Tubba Blubba fight is the shortest one yet, and players immediately learn that the 4th Star Spirit is being held in Shy Guy's toy box from Bowser and Cammy directly. There's a quick question and answer session where they ask Peach about things that Mario hates, but the game ends the segment after this part to keep the player guessing how the answers impact things in the upcoming chapter. Skolar is introduced as the Star Spirit who tried to escape in Gusty Gulch, and his ability is Starstorm, a super useful attack that deals high damage to enemies. Chapter 4 is unique because it starts as soon as the player gets back to Toad Town. Players get to see Shy Guys running around stealing items from NPCs all over the town, and the music's changed to a frantic, fast-paced melody. I like this approach because the Shy Guys render most things in Toad Town temporarily unavailable, so players have an additional challenge to contend with since they can't use the resources the town's always offered. Twink makes a brief appearance, and it turns out that Shy Guy's toy box is actually located in Toad Town itself. Bo's the key to finding it, and using her invisibility powers in the empty house reveals a secret wall that leads to the toy box. I have to commend the developers for the toy box setting, because not only is it unique, it's also aesthetically on point. Everything is so colorful, and the platforming bits are made out of actual toys. Shy Guys play dress up and wear different costumes, and that grants them different attacks. And the music here is very childlike. Nintendo nailed the aesthetic here, and it really helps the toy box stand out. Structurally, the toy box is splintered into 4 different areas that are color-coded and connected by train tracks. Players must fix the train tracks in each section in order to move on between each area. But the linearity here is actually pretty good because almost every section is brimming with unique set pieces, obstacles, and challenges. First up is the Blue Station, which features a playground full of Shy Guys running around with a ton of different items, along with the super hard mini-boss if players want to test out their skills. Throughout the toy box, players will find and retrieve some of the stolen items the Shy Guys took from people in Toad Town, and this gives Chapter 4 a little bit of a unique flavor. Players will constantly be going in and out of the toy box returning these items, and by doing so, players begin to restore Toad Town back to normal, allowing them to use the corresponding resource. The Blue Station contains the bad shop owner's calculator and the storeroom key, which gives the players the model train and allows them to move to the next station. Kammy Koopa makes an appearance in the Blue Station, and this is where those questions from the last Peach scene come into play. Whatever the player chose previously is what she'll generate to get in the way of Mario, and I really like how this part comes full circle. In the Pink Station, Mario finds the frying pan, and it's up to the player to take it back to Taste Tea in Toad Town to make a cake for this massive Shy Guy named Gourmet Guy who's blocking the path. This actually highlights a minor but relatively frequent problem with Shy Guy's toy box, and that's getting in and out of it. Players can only get back to Toad Town from the Blue Station, which means there's a decent amount of backtracking every time they have to leave. This could have easily been solved by allowing players to leave from any station color and presenting them with an option to choose the station when they re-enter. It's not too time consuming the way it's currently set up, but this is an area where the developers could have cut out a little bit of padding. The slight backtracking is worth it though, because this happens when Mario gives the cake to Gourmet Guy. I love this part, and it makes Gourmet Guy such an unforgettable character. The green station is the smallest in the entire toy box, and there's really not much to say about it. There's a few colored blocks in the lobby that require the player to hit them in a set order, and that order is found by locating a note and dictionary for Rusty in Toad Town. There's a simple conveyor belt puzzle that requires Bo's invisibility, but that's all that stands in the way of getting these few items. Rusty deciphers the order and it gives us access to our final destination, the red station. This is where Shy Guy's toy box really kicks things up a notch, and also where my emulator goes to die because it really doesn't like to display any dark runes. There's a platforming section here that leads to the Big Lantern Ghost, a mini-boss who has a fun little unique mechanic to him. The fight takes place in the dark, and while it's dark, he can't be targeted or hit. His lantern generates light when attacked and can render him hittable. It's a pretty simple mechanic, but it does add a little bit of spice to what otherwise would be a normal mini-boss fight, and I really like how it's incorporated into the battle. Defeating the Big Lantern Ghost rewards us with Watt, a little Sparky who's been trapped in his lantern that wants to join the party since we set her free. I like how the game subverts expectations a bit and does not give players a new partner at the beginning of the chapter, because Watt now feels like a reward for both beating the mini-boss and for getting this far in the toy box. Watt is definitely a unique idea for a party member, and she is also very useful. Her electrical abilities can light up dark rooms in the overworld and also expose hidden blocks. In battle, Watt can paralyze enemies and also has a unique property that negates an enemy's defense stat when her action commands are timed correctly. She's one of my absolute favorite partners we get in the game, and her abilities really elevate her above other partners for me. With Watt acquired, it's time to finish the toy box by storming the rest of the red station. Meet General Guy, the leader of the Shy Guy army responsible for causing all of the chaos in Toad Town. General Guy has a lot of excellent one-liners that make him a fun character to fight against, and the fight itself is actually pretty great. He sends wave after wave of Shy Guys at Mario, all in different formations, until he decides to fight with a tank made of building blocks. There's a light on it that Watt can destroy with her electric-based attacks, and she's also immune from any electric attacks she could receive. General Guy is a great fight that is very, very entertaining, and it's a huge step up from the heart fight in Chapter 3. The fourth Peach scene is probably the most infamous one amongst Paper Mario fans. For reasons unknown, Gourmet Guy is back and about time too, and this time he's in the mood for more cake. Donkey Kong 64 lyrics aside, I kind of love how he just randomly appears again despite it making no sense at all. This time it's up to Peach and Twink to make him a cake, and there's a quick minigame where players have to follow Twink's instructions to make it correctly. The minigame itself isn't that hard, but one step requires players to put the cake in the oven for 30 seconds. The timing window here is actually pretty large, but if a player gets it wrong, they'll have to restart the entire minigame, so it can be a little bit frustrating. But when players do make a perfect cake, well, we know what happens. Gourmet Guy is so grateful for the tasty treat that he actually tells Peach the 5th Star Spirit is being held in Mount Lava Lava on Lava Lava Island. Twink relays the message to Mario, and it's cool how Twink actually gets to meet a Star Spirit for the first time. After briefly freaking out, the Star Spirit introduces himself as Muscular and grants us a power to lower enemies' attacks in battle. Typically, I don't really use this power a lot, but on this specific playthrough, it was invaluable since I was doing a low HP run, and it saved me plenty of times. With Toad Town restored, Muscular heads to Star Haven, finishing Chapter 4. Chapter 5 borrows a bit from Chapter 2 because it brings back Colorado from earlier in the game. He's hanging out by Toad Town's docks and is trying to figure out a way to get to Lava Lava Island to find a legendary treasure. This works out perfectly because there's this fun whale guy who's at the docks, and he's willing to take us for fixing up his stomach. I always loved this whale guy, and especially when he breaks the fourth wall and calls Mario Dr. Mario. After shuttling everyone across the sea, Mario and Colorado arrive on Lava Lava Island, and it's one of the best parts of the entire game. I tend to love tropical places in video games anyways, but the real great part about Lava Lava Island is that it's home to a whole bunch of Yoshis. The music here is a remix of the Yoshi's Island title screen, and it's been updated perfectly to fit into the Paper Mario style of things. Colorado runs ahead of us to explore Mount Lava Lava, but after finding out it's inaccessible, tragedy strikes the village as the Fearsome Five have gone missing in the jungle. They're a group of young Yoshi kids, and the task falls to the player to save them. In order to do so, Mario gets introduced to Sushi, the cheap who looks after the kids and decides to join our party to get them back. Sushi's inclusion has never really gelled with me. She's not a bad partner at all, but her motherly personality has always seemed out of place. Sure, it works perfectly fine for the Fearsome Five rescue, but outside of that, I always feel like her overly cautious nature never really meshes with the rest of the adventure. Sushi is a lot better in terms of gameplay though. She can let Mario swim and dive in the water, but she is limited to these wooden docks instead of being able to freely do it. In battle, she has a variety of water attacks that can hit enemies for a bunch of damage, and she's even more effective against fire enemies. The search for the Fearsome Five is actually a lot of fun. Normally I'm not a huge fan of these fetch quests, but the search is well designed and is a step up in complexity compared to previous chapters. The Jade Jungle is absolutely sprawling in terms of scope, and the Yoshi kids can be rescued by being found in the level geometry, in caves, or even by fighting enemies near them. Players have to navigate by water and land, and it's such a step up from the more linear locations before it. The jungle weirdly also has a lot of one-off mechanics, such as bushes that reveal hidden pathways, and flowers that allow Mario to float onto higher ground. Finding the Fearsome Five ultimately leads Mario to another Yoshi's Island callback, Raphael the Raven. He helps us create a path to Mount Lava Lava and gives us the Ultra Stone, an item that allows partners to be upgraded one more additional time via Super Blocks. The reward is still the same where partners get an additional move and do more damage, so there's nothing really new for players to learn, but it feels good to be able to upgrade partners for a second time. Mount Lava Lava is a lot more like Dry Dry Ruins in the sense that it's a bit more open with a few bottlenecks, but it also has an additional emphasis on platforming. The entire area is not surprisingly covered in lava, and missing jumps here can cause a lot of damage to the player that adds up over time. Enemies here are also a noticeable step up in terms of difficulty, and I think these two things combined are some of the reasons why I like Chapter 5 so much. It feels appropriate that this is the spot where the difficulty curve spikes up a bit. Colorado accompanies the player through the volcano, and he has a lot of great scenes and one-liners. He adds nothing to the actual gameplay, but I like him here since it makes the character dynamic a lot more interesting. Players obtain the Ultra Hammer here, but similarly to the Super Hammer, it's just a slightly more powerful cosmetic upgrade since the game now replaces those stone blocks with metal blocks to halt any sort of progression. One thing that does bother me about Chapter 5 though is the over-reliance on block puzzles. Mount Lava Lava is full of a ton of different obstacles, and some are unique and entertaining, but both the jungle and the volcano have these slow-moving block puzzles that take a little bit too long. Even the blocks they use here are all these generic plain blue ones. If these block puzzles had to be here, the developer should have at least visually contextualized these blocks to the surroundings, such as making them rocks in the volcano. It's a small visual change, but it's one that would have made these puzzles a lot more enjoyable. Lava Piranha is the boss of Mount Lava Lava, and he might be my favorite boss fight in the entire game. He always reminds me of a direct throwback to Mega Smilax from Super Mario RPG, but with a lot more fire. Or maybe it's just Intelligent Systems trying their best to summon Roy for a quick appearance. Either way, Lava Piranha has 2 smaller buds, and all 3 can use powerful fire attacks against Mario. It's no surprise that Sushi is very effective here with her water-based attacks, but Lava Piranha has a surprise of its own. After taking a beatdown, the battle ends and Mario and team is granted experience points like normal. That is until the game pulls out the rug from the player and Roy is revived and Lava Piranha is revived with even more fire. I love how the game convinces the player that the boss is finished, only to time his revival perfectly. It's something that I love about the Lava Piranha fight, and it's so memorable because of how unexpected it can be, and I think it's one of the reasons why Paper Mario fans hold this boss in such a high regard. Before the next Peach scene can begin, there's a little bit more to do in the volcano. Miss Star, the newly saved Star Spirit, helps us escape the erupting volcano, and the legendary treasure that Colorado's been after lands somewhere in the jungle. Miss Star herself comes with the Smooch ability, letting players heal themselves for 20 HP when it's used. This is definitely my most used star power throughout the game, so I'm always thrilled when I rescue her. The 5th Peach scene is one of my favorites. After a quick sneaking session, Peach gets roped into playing a game show with some of Bowser's minions. The questions here let players figure out that the next Star Spirit is being held in a place called Flower Fields, and just for participating, the player also receives the Sneaky Parasol. This item is fantastic because it lets Peach transform into anyone it's pointed at, but for some reason, the game doesn't let you use it because the scene just suddenly ends. It's a great tease since it foreshadows the next Peach scene, but I always think it could have been more effective if the developers constructed a scenario where it needed to be used to end the scene. Chapter 5 finishes up with another Junior Troopa fight, but this time it's my favorite one in the game. We see him swimming back and forth to Lava Lava Island to try and find Mario, and as a result, he only has half HP when the battle starts. This makes it a super quick fight that's wrapped in some great cutscenes, and it's a nice send-off for the chapter. And it's a good thing too that the developers made it quick, because the start to Chapter 6 is anything but quick. Chapter 6 can be found in Toad Town just like Chapter 4, but unlike the toy box, the entrance to Flower Fields is not easily accessible. There's an empty arch near the Bad Shop which will eventually become the entrance to the fields, but players can only access it once they've collected 4 magical seeds from these guys called Ball Bulbs, and they're found in previous chapters. Chapter 6, unfortunately, is all about padding, and yes, more padding. Having to collect a few items to access a chapter isn't inherently wrong, but Paper Mario does a pretty subpar job how it handles this fetch quest. At this point in the adventure, the game has not communicated at all that the player should be collecting these seeds, so it's probable that new players will be missing some. The game gets around this problem by having Min T, a toad near the arch, tell players that they can use Merlin to discern their locations. But that means that players either have to use help they may not want or wander around aimlessly searching for the seeds. I've played through Paper Mario several times, so I know to collect the seeds as I go, but for this playthrough, I decided to leave them all until the start of Chapter 6. Despite knowing the exact location of each seed and having badges that enhance Mario's movement speed, it still took me over 20 minutes to collect them all. It's very likely that new players will likely take 45 minutes or even an hour to get all the seeds, and it's a real shame that this process is required for players to start Chapter 6. The real kicker here is that the developers didn't even pack these areas with extra goodies that require new partner abilities to get. But here's the bigger problem. The padding in Chapter 6 never really ends. Flower Fields itself is a colorful area with a visual aesthetic that's hard to beat, but the structure of this place brings the gameplay to an absolute halt. The fields have a central hub with 6 individual narrow corridors jetting from the left and right side of it. This by itself isn't bad, and it's an interesting new formula for a chapter, but the major issue here is that the game blocks 5 out of the 6 hallways immediately and makes players go through them in a set and defined order. This is because Mario is tasked with getting several items to make a beanstalk road to take out Huff and Puff, a cloud monster working from Bowser that has made life insufferable for the citizens of the fields. Players can only obtain these items in order, which means that players will have to go through a hallway, reach the end to obtain one of the items, go back through the same hallway, reach the central hub, and then rinse and repeat that process 5 more times. To make it worse, the game even has a scenario where Mario reaches the end of one of these hallways and is told to go back, effectively doubling the length of one of these loops. Flower Fields also has the most aggressive enemy found in the entire game, the Bazap. Its attacks on the overworld are super difficult to dodge, and combined with the incredibly narrow space from the hallway structure, it essentially ensures that players are going to be doing an excessive amount of battling throughout Chapter 6. Compounding this is that each hallway is made up of several rooms, and that forces enemies to respawn every time a player leaves one and re-enters another. This constant retreading through the same narrow corridors combined with the sharp increase in battle count makes Chapter 6 time-consuming and honestly a little bit tedious. The thing that kills it for me is that there absolutely was a way to make this structure work. All the developers had to do was make every hallway accessible from the start instead of locking everything behind a set order. I am fully confident this would have worked, because it would have kept the goal of collecting the items the same while giving players a chapter that is completely non-linear. There would have been a little retreading through a hallway back to the central hub, but the freedom of choice would have gone a long way to mitigate the feeling of backtracking. This would have even been a better structure for repeat playthroughs, since players could always choose how they want to get through the chapter differently every single time. It sucks because the other parts of Flower Fields are actually quite great. I love how there's a whole new race of characters to interact with, and unlike the boos from earlier, the developers put a lot more effort into making some nice original characters. The new partner Mario gets in this chapter is a Lakitu named Lake-Alester, and he actually starts as an enemy and fights the player before changing allegiances. He's a very useful partner that allows players to now cross spikes and lava, and that's ultimately needed to gain access to the final hallway of Flower Fields where the player gets to destroy the Puff Puff machine, the source of the terrible clouds poisoning the fields. In battle, Lake-Alester can actually hide Mario in his cloud to make attacks miss more frequently, and he can attack by throwing spiny enemies at anyone on the field. With the smog cleared and all of the items obtained, players are finally able to grow the beanstalk and reach the clouds to fight Huff and Puff, who is easily my least favorite boss fight in the entire game and is a huge step down from Lava Piranha from the previous chapter. I've never found him to be a particularly interesting character in the first place, but the fight here drags on and on and on. I had a particularly frustrating battle with him during this playthrough. Huff and Puff can't be damaged by Mario's hammer, and I forgot to equip jump badges for this fight, so I could almost inflict no damage per turn. This is because every time Huff and Puff is attacked, he creates mini copies of himself that he can suck up to heal himself. I really like this mechanic by itself, but with no jump badges, this fight alone took me over 25 minutes. At least the next Peach scene makes up for it. Players finally get to use the Sneaky Parasol, and it's an item that just really feels fun. I love going around and copying the Koopa Patrol guards and talking to them to learn more about working for Bowser. The castle really opens up here too, and players are tasked with finding a missing Clubba who's late for his shift. What's more interesting here is that when the scene ends, players don't know the location of the last Star Spirit. I love this change because it makes the last chapter feel so much more daunting compared to previous ones. Players don't know where they're going, they don't know what kind of area it is, and they don't know who's waiting for them at the end. The Star Spirit we just saved is Clevar, who lets us stop enemies completely in battle. It's another useful power, but it's similar to Mamar's Lullaby in the sense that it can be a bit unreliable. Clevar departs for Star Haven, and before we can do the same from Flower Fields, I do want to point out that I really don't mind Chapter 6 despite my criticism of it. It's not my favorite chapter, not by a long shot, but the neat characters combined with the incredible aesthetic is enough to keep me engaged during the whole thing. It's also a chapter that goes by way quicker on repeat playthroughs, and although that's not the best way to design a Paper Mario chapter, it has helped it grow on me in subsequent playthroughs. It's an unfortunate rough spot in what otherwise has been a great adventure up until this point. You know, it's well worth it though, because Chapter 7 is one of my favorites in the entire game, with the exception of how it starts. I think it's great how the game lets players try and figure out the location of the last Star Spirit themselves, but the problem is that the game, well, punishes players for trying to figure it out themselves. Let me explain. The last Star Spirit can be found by going into the sewers and finding this icy blue door. If a player gets to this spot on their own, they're actually stuck and they can never get through it. No matter what players try, the door is permanently locked. That's because the game decides that the players have to talk to Merlin before being able to get to the next location. This, in my opinion, was the completely wrong approach. Paper Mario purposely doesn't tell players where to go, yet at the same time, it prevents players from progressing until they seek out the in-game guide on where they have to go. Players are ready to go after the final Star Spirit, and if they haven't used help up until this point, they're more likely to avoid Merlin rather than actively seek him out. This can lead to players wandering around aimlessly before being forced to give in and get help, leading to an unrewarding feeling. Back at his place, Merlin has a guest Ninja over, and both of them inform Mario that Merlin's son has requested their presence at a place called Starborn Valley. The journey through the sewers yields the Ultra Boots, which give players the ability to perform a slightly higher version of the ground pound. There's also a ton of super blocks in this area, and I'm pretty confident that the developers put them in there on purpose to ensure that players have partners at a high enough level before going into one of the last parts of the game. Ultimately, players find a pipe behind the icy blue door that leads to a town called Shiver City. Shiver City, in my opinion, is home to one of the best gameplay segments of the entire adventure, and it's easy to argue that it might just be the single best segment of the entire game. Players are unable to leave the city because residents have cited a crazy person that's been running around, and Mario can only leave once he gets permission from Mayor Penguin. When Mario gets to his house, his wife lets him in, and they both find him unconscious in the back room. He's clutching a note from someone named Herringway, but no one knows what it means. The mayor's wife screams for help, and Mario is immediately deemed to be the primary suspect of murdering Mayor Penguin. We need to stop and admire the creativity from Nintendo here. Mario, the family-friendly mascot of the entire industry, is accused of straight-up murdering a character in one of his games. The developers even went a step further because everyone in the town starts to treat Mario as a convicted killer and often beg him not to be his next victim. This whole scenario is utterly ridiculous, but it really highlights how good Paper Mario is when it embraces the out-of-the-box ideas. Luckily for us, it's pretty easy to prove Mario's innocence. Players simply have to find Herringway in his house by taking a secret chimney entrance, and it turns out that Mayor Penguin simply hit his head. Upon leaving the city, the player is ambushed by Junior Troopa, and it's thematically appropriate because it turns out he's the insane guy hanging around town that all the penguins were referring to earlier. It's a more difficult fight than the previous ones, but that feels appropriate at this stage of the game. Merlin's son Merly is here, and he tells us that the last Star Spirit is being held in the Crystal Palace atop Shiver Mountain. He also tells the player that they'll need to figure out just how to get there. Merly gives us the scarf and tells us that Mayor Penguin has the other item, which turns out to be a bucket. And you know what? It just so happens that between the two towns there are a bunch of snowmen where each is missing one of their respective items. Not sure why the developers made this puzzle so easy, but it's more about the plot than anything else at this point, so I'll give it a pass. Shiver Mountain is very different from any other region because it's a significant vertical climb. Enemies here drop more experience than previous ones, and this is definitely done intentionally to ensure that players are at a high enough level this late into the game. There's a few puzzles here and there that players will encounter as they climb the mountain, but it doesn't take long for Mario to finally arrive at the Crystal Palace. Crystal Palace is a phenomenal final dungeon, and it's built around a central theme: mirrors and duplication. There's a pane of glass that runs through the entire building, and it separates the dungeon into a foreground and background section where changing something on one side can alter something on the other. Every puzzle throughout the entire palace uses this central mechanic, and the game requires the player to understand the relationship between the two sides in order to progress. For example, players early on will find a wooden panel that they have to break in the background, and that creates a hole in the ground in the foreground. The aesthetic of this place is also wonderfully designed. The music that loops in the palace feels empty and serene, and it feels more thoughtful than previous places in the game. The visuals here are also a bit darker, and the mirror effect is surprisingly well rendered for the Nintendo 64. It really feels like a place that's just been abandoned and unknown to the rest of the world for a large amount of time. The other neat thing that happens in the Crystal Palace are these parts where using partner abilities causes duplicates of the partner to appear. These are the work of the Duplighost enemy, who can copy the current partner on the field, and they'll try to trick Mario into choosing the wrong one. There's no real consequences here if the player picks wrong since they just enter a normal battle, but I like how it plays off the mirror theme. I especially love the duplication guessing game with Kooper, since all of the enemies take the form of characters that are very clearly not Kooper. It seems like the developers had a lot of fun here, and they may have even put in this part as a joke, but I think those feelings really get passed to the player with charming moments like this. The boss of this icy place is the Crystal King, and he's a massive step up from Huff and Puff. The music here has a nice ambient build-up and then gives off a tremendous amount of energy, and it matches because the Crystal King can hit really, really hard. He's easily the most difficult fight to this point, and there will definitely be some players that struggle with him when fighting him for the first time. The higher difficulty of this fight is appropriately timed, and it's one of the things that make him incredibly memorable. Sticking with the mirror theme of the palace, the Crystal King can make copies of himself. This is a pretty common thing to see in RPG games, but I like the implementation here because it makes perfect sense with the surrounding area. Players can easily discern which copy is the real copy via multi-hit attacks, which does make the fight a little bit more simpler than it could have been, but overall, I don't really have any complaints in this battle. This fight, along with the Koopa Bros fight and Lava Piranha fight, is one of my favorites in the game. With the last Star Spirit saved comes the last Peach scene, and this one is extremely brief with no gameplay. Bowser finds out that all the Star Spirits have been rescued, and decides to make final preparations for Mario's impending arrival. I like how the developers showed some restraint here because I think skipping the slower paced gameplay from Peach in favor of the story works better because it shuttles players quickly along the final homestretch of the game. And hey, Twig shows up here too and tries to save the princess by hilariously taking on Bowser himself. And it's a nice way to end Peach's involvement with the gameplay. Kamar is the star spirit we just saved, and his ability turns enemies into stars, which essentially ends any battle where it's successful. Being the last star spirit, he instructs the players to go back to Shooting Star Summit, and the game's finally come full circle. The little bit of time it takes to get back to Toad Town is well placed, and it gives players a breather to reflect on how far they've come, but also to build the anticipation for what awaits them next at Shooting Star Summit. Chapter 8 is a lot like Chapter 7 for me. It's one of my absolute favorites in the game, but the way it starts really could have seen some improvement. Chapter 8 gets started at the top of Shooting Star Summit, and it's one of the game's biggest missed opportunities. Starway is a place that connects the world to Star Haven, and while the visuals here are stunning, especially for the Nintendo 64, it's nothing more than a short spiraling path filled with these out-of-place fire enemies. Star Haven's been teased throughout the entire game at this point, and this is supposed to be the lead up to it in the last chapter. I think the devs should have made this part longer and more varied, so players would really be able to feel that sense of anticipation as they got closer to it. Star Haven is the last town in the game that the players will get to visit, and while it's visually nice, there's not much to do here other than to get on with the story. The Star Spirits collectively thank Mario for his help throughout the game and bestow him with the Star Beam, a new star power that completely negates the effects of the Star Rod. Without delay, they also gift Mario with a ship to reach Bowser's castle in the sky. There's a nice little cutscene here that sees the residents of Toad Town making a wish to see the princess, and for some reason, it always makes me hungry for some shroom cake. Bowser's Castle is an absolutely epic final dungeon, and in my opinion is actually the pinnacle of the entire game. The first thing I always notice here is the music. It sounds menacing and even thrilling at times, and it really sets the tone for the last stretch of gameplay. The track itself is dynamic, and it layers more and more instrumentation as the player gets closer to the end. This fills the moment-to-moment gameplay with some nice tension and anticipation, since players always feel like Bowser is going to be in the next part of the castle. It's my favorite song in Paper Mario, and it's a wonderful atmospheric piece that helps make the castle feel intimidating. One thing that really separates Bowser's Castle from the other chapters' dungeons is that it's not tied down by a single theme or mechanic. Koopa Bros Fortress had the staircases and story interjections, Dry Dry Ruins had the rising sand, and the Crystal Palace had the satisfying mirror puzzles, but Bowser's Castle makes up for this by being incredibly long and varied. Players will find elements from previous chapters along with a few new ones, and the chapter even has sections where every single partner gets to use their ability at least one final time. There's also much more of an emphasis on platforming throughout the entire castle, and enemies here are more aggressive and much more powerful than they were before. One new element that Bowser's Castle does introduce are these narcissistically designed Bowser guard doors. Throughout the castle, players will encounter 3 of these in total, and each of them will test the player in different ways before allowing them to pass. 2 of them offer trivia games in slightly different styles with different possible penalties should the player fail, but the last guard door offers something completely different, and this is where Paper Mario breaks my heart every time I get to this part. That music. It's the Koopa Bros. Oh man, I love these guys in Chapter 1, and the guard door wants me to throw down with them right now. This boss fight is going to be amazing because the designers can include every mechanic up to this point with 4 enemies to deal with at once, and they can also show how far the player has come. But no, the game decides to throw all of that potential away for yet another Junior Troopa fight. You know, this is probably the biggest reason why I've just never been a fan of this guy. The developers definitely put too many encounters with him throughout the game till this point, and I think that's a fair thing to say. But this 6th encounter is where it absolutely crosses the line into absurdity. Not only does it make absolutely no sense that Junior Troopa is here, which shatters the immersive feeling that Bowser's Castle is impenetrable this whole time, a feeling that the game wants players to have throughout the adventure by the way, but the fight itself just sucks. Instead of combining everything for one last encounter, it's broken down into 3 phases where Junior Troopa uses different forms and attacks that players have seen before. This part right here is the only true mistake in Chapter 8 for me, and while it doesn't take away much of my overall enjoyment from it, I'm actually quite surprised that the developers chose to include him here and didn't think that the player would be sick of him by this point. The Junior Troopa fight caps off the Bowser's Castle section of the final dungeon, and players are now finally able to enter Peach's castle. I love how empty the castle is because it really gives a sense that Bowser has withdrawn all his forces and is preparing for the player's arrival knowing he failed to stop them sooner. It's also the last breather players get before the final confrontation, and it allows players to snag any items they may have missed during the Peach scenes. The music here feels haunting and empty, and at this point, the game has truly come full circle. Nothing solidifies this more than the long hallway where Mario was previously defeated by Bowser, who just so happens to be waiting for us in that exact same spot. I love the direct callback to the start of Super Mario RPG with Peach hanging from the ceiling watching the fight while tied up. The game makes no secret that this is a warm-up fight, and it's a quick and easy way of forcing players to understand exactly how the star beam works before they need to rely on it. Bowser quickly realizes he's in trouble and retreats to the top of the castle. After a small walk in complete silence, it's time for the final confrontation. Aided by an arena that increases Bowser's power and size for some reason, Mario and Bowser finally get to settle the score once and for all. Well, not really, because it turns out the star beam is useless in this arena, and it's time for the game's real MVP to step in and save the day. After a scripted story moment with Twink, Peach, and Kammy Koopa, Paper Mario decides that Twink is the best character in the entire game, and he gets so strong that he floats on over to Bowser and bops him on the head and retrieves the Star Rod himself. The end. Or at least, that's how it should have ended. Twink and Peach actually power up the Star Beam and make it the Peach Beam, and it now has the power to negate the newly found strength of the Star Rod. Now it's time for the real final fight. I don't mind that the game has delayed it a little bit, because I think the previous battle with Bowser and the Kammy Koopa fight are justified story inclusions, but none of them can compare to the last battle with Bowser. The music here is some of the best in the game, and it's actually a remix of that slower ambient track that plays throughout Peach's castle before. The battle itself is a long back and forth with the King of the Koopas, and he has a variety of attacks that make the fight engaging and fun. Sure, he still uses the Star Rod's power to force players to use the Peach Beam, but he has a new arsenal consisting of lightning attacks, fire attacks, claw attacks, jump attacks, and a few more. The fight just feels like a tremendous challenge compared to every other fight in the game, and the payoff is so satisfying when Bowser's HP drops to 0. I think the developers really need to be commended on how they handled this fight, both from the well-executed lead-up before the final confrontation to the varied and inspired gameplay the battle actually has. Paper Mario ends with a few nice cutscenes where the Star Spirits take back the Star Rod and restore Peach's castle back to its rightful spot. It's a predictable ending, but it still does feel satisfying. One thing that really helps the ending is the series of back-to-back cutscenes that show each partner receiving a letter from Peach inviting them to a party. Mario and Luigi get this letter too, and the player is given one last chance to stroll around the main areas of Toad Town and interact with any residents. The very last scene before the credits is Peach thanking players for everything they've done in front of major characters throughout the adventure, and the credits roll with a parade featuring small vignettes of all the major characters in this game. With it, Paper Mario has come to an end. It may be obvious from everything we've talked about at this point, but Paper Mario is such a tremendous game. There's even more things I haven't touched on yet that help the overall experience. The paper aesthetic was completely unique when the game was released, and it makes the game feel so visually distinct, and it's played up perfectly throughout the entire game. Houses open like cardboard dioramas when entered, and Mario slips into bed like a falling sheet of paper. The soundtrack is varied, and pretty much every song is great to listen to both in-game and out of it. The game's pacing, progression, and difficulty curve is spot on and requires no needless grinding. There's like 5 optional mini-bosses players can fight for extra challenges. Chuck Quizmo appears randomly in towns and quizzes players about the adventure for star pieces. Toads have pun-tastic names relevant to the situation they're in or who they are. There's just so much to love here about this game. Paper Mario is a feel-good joyride full of charm and humor with rock-solid gameplay that offers an incredible amount of depth that's driven completely by the player's control and agency. The game is at its best when it embraces original concepts like Shy Guy's Toy Box or the Penguin Murder Mystery, but still finds a way to make everything feel right at home in the Mario universe. There may be a few rough places in it, such as the intro or the super safe plot, along with the inconsistent approach to player freedom at times, but these are easy to get past when the vast majority of the game is engaging, fun, and full of charm. It's easy to see that Intelligent Systems crafted this game with so much passion, and while it's not Super Mario RPG 2, Paper Mario stands on its own as a unique game that is still a worthy Mario RPG title. One of the things that my friends and I like to do when discussing favorite things about a particular game is graph out our experiences for each major part. We always make them super quick in paint and they look terrible, but they're weirdly effective when we're talking about our experiences with a game. With that said, this is my Paper Mario enjoyment graph. I think the game's strongest point is the final 2 chapters, and they always leave me wanting to play more. I think that's the main reason why I come back to the game so often. The Mayor Penguin Murder Mystery, Crystal Palace, and all of Bowser's Castle stick out to me as the best moments, whereas the intro and Chapter 2 tend to be low points for me. It's rare that a game can truly finish with its best bits of content, but in my opinion, Paper Mario is an exemplary title where the experience gets better the more a player is invested in it. Paper Mario went on to be a critical and commercial success for the Nintendo 64, selling over 1 million copies during its initial launch. It's given me and other players countless playthroughs filled with fun and laughs. It's a game that I wholeheartedly recommend for anyone who's a Nintendo or RPG fan. Nintendo and Intelligent Systems did a terrific job carrying the torch from Squaresoft, and they must have known what they had because years later, they decided to take another crack at it by releasing Paper Mario: The Thousand Year Door for the Nintendo GameCube. But we'll have to talk about that game another time. Hey everyone, thank you for watching the design breakdown and retrospective for Paper Mario. I'd love to know what you think of Paper Mario, so let me know in the comments how your experience was with this game. If you like this video and want to see more, please hit the like button and consider subscribing to the channel for more retrospectives and game design analysis. And it would be even better if you could share this video with your buddies so the channel can grow. You can also find a link to my Twitter profile, and I've already started working on a new video in the meantime. This was my first shot at something like this, so please let me know what you thought and give some constructive feedback in the comments. I want to give a special shout out to my friends JJ, BB, and SGR for all their support while I was working on this project. They helped give me ideas, they helped with script editing, they've been supportive, and they've just been terrific throughout the entire thing. SGR is actually doing a retrospective right now on Pikmin, and when it's ready, I'll be sure to link it in the description here. I've also linked a few other YouTube channels that do retrospectives, which really helped inspire me to take my own stab at it, so please give them a view. Thanks for watching everyone, and I'll see you next time for more game design breakdowns and other content.